There is a great disappointment.
I call the Honourable Member Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Mr Chairman, when the bill was originally introduced to the House, we in New Zealand First thought, thank goodness, finally the government is moving on the housing crisis. And we thought it was high time that it did, because it had waited at least 5 years doing absolutely nothing while a housing crisis developed in New Zealand. So we thought, thank goodness, something's going to be done. And then as we began to study the bill and understand it, we realised that actually not very much was going to be done at all, especially for low-income people seeking their first homes, and especially in terms of addressing the issue of affordability. So now, Mr Chairman, New Zealand First is regretfully going to vote against the bill. And we're not going to vote against the bill now because we're opposed to the concept of housing accords with local government. We welcome that. We think that it's appropriate that central government and local government should work together on addressing the housing crisis in New Zealand. And we're not voting against it either because we're against the concept of special housing areas. We think that is also a good concept and is one good way of moving forward and making sure that adequate land is made available for housing in New Zealand. Those are not the reasons we're voting against it. It is because, in fact, this government is actually not doing nearly enough about the housing crisis which has developed. And it's not doing nearly enough about affordability. I've heard what the Minister has just said about affordability, but I'm one of those New Zealanders who are totally unconvinced by what the Minister says and by what this government is failing to do, in fact, about the problem of affordability of housing in New Zealand. We don't accept that simply flooding the market with land available for housing will actually solve anything very much at all, especially not affordability, and especially not making it possible for first home owners to achieve their first home in this country. Now something which is so far beyond possibility for those people that you can call it virtually impossible. And Mr Speaker, Mr Chairman, there are additional problems. Planning instruments are to be compromised by this legislation, and local democracy will be sidelined as well because of some of the particular provisions in the bill. Mr Chairman, I want to specifically refer to SOPs, Phil Twyford's SOPs 242, 243 and 342, 343 and 344. And 342 has a provision which provides that no plan change or variation to a proposed plan would be able to be permitted, which is inconsistent with the Waitakere Ranges Heritage Area Act 2008. In fact, it's a much wider issue than that. It's a wider issue of consistency with plan changes altogether. And this highlights, Mr Chairman, how the bill would compromise district and city planning instruments and sets local democracy aside. The bill is a pretty blunt instrument when you look at it. It's something of a panic measure. It's a measure which is unbalanced in favour of a quick fix attempt for a problem which has been years in the making, and we are very concerned that some of the good work done in planning by many local authorities will in fact be compromised by the bill. Mr Chairman, moving on to SOP 343, New Zealand First will support that as well. It would seek to remove the override provisions in the bill. We believe in New Zealand First that that is appropriate. The amendment requires that there must be a housing accord if an order for a special housing area is to be made. We in New Zealand First believe that the government should negotiate and negotiate and negotiate until it in fact reaches an agreement, and there should not be an ability to set that process aside and to simply impose an accord on a local district or city. That's not appropriate, and that should not be happening. And Mr Chairman, we don't believe that if the provision for the override was not there, then that would unduly constrain the government. and that is simply because local governments are just as keen as central government to reach agreement on special housing areas and to make sure that, in fact, their plans, their local planning instruments, Mr Chairman,
The Honourable Member, Dennis O'Rourke.
to make sure that those local councils can act to ensure through the negotiating process that their good work and planning processes are not compromised and set aside. The problem with that override provision is just this. The government, if it's just tired of the process or doesn't believe in the sincerity of the local government or simply doesn't agree with them, can just brush them aside and impose a special housing area or an accord of its own, or rather do what it likes effectively. And that is simply not appropriate in the circumstances, and that's the reason why we will support SOP 343. Turning to SOP 344, that would enable housing accords to require a minimum proportion of housing which is affordable. That, as I've already said, Mr Chairman, is a very important issue for New Zealand First, and we think provisions along these lines are very, very much needed indeed. In fact, we think that is one of the most important issues of all. You see, profit motive for developers cause them to favour large sections and large houses to make larger profits. And when you look around, and I've looked around Christchurch with a friend looking for a smaller home on a smaller section, do you think we could find one in all those subdivisions that are happening now around Christchurch? Very, very difficult indeed to find a smaller home on a smaller subdivision. And that is a significant problem because those properties are very expensive, much too expensive for too many people, especially first home seekers. So, if there is to be a government lead in terms of special housing areas, then the government also needs to lead to make sure that people needing smaller homes on smaller sections are catered for. We don't believe that the current provisions of the bill and the current intentions of the government are actually to address the needs of those people at all. We believe that there needs to be a good mix of smaller homes on smaller sections as a mandatory requirement of all developments taking place as a result of special housing areas under this bill. And in that way, we can make sure that at least some of the properties that will be made available will be more affordable. And in that way, indirectly, we can start to afford the issue of affordability. But affordability, of course, is much wider than that. And in fact, we in New Zealand First think that the government should be making assistance directly available to first home seekers in terms of ways to assist them to find a deposit that they are now going to need 20% for a first home. The government's not doing that. That's a glaring omission, and we think that is something that they need to do. Just fiddling with retirement savings, KiwiSaver, is not going to address that problem. We all know that. The government seems to think it will. It won't. Much, much more needs to be done. Governments of the past have done much more. Mr Chairman, I myself bought my first section many decades ago now, admittedly, with a home ownership account. A very good system of assisting people to save for their first home, getting tax refunds to help them to do that. That's the sort of thing that New Zealand First adopts as its policy approach, and which we would like to see the government to consider as well. So for those reasons, Mr Chairman, New Zealand First will be supporting Phil Twyford's SOPs, but in the end, with regret, we will be voting against this bill.
I call the Honourable Member Marianne Street.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. I rise to speak to the second reading